I think we'll go ahead and just get started here as folks trickle in from lunch. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. My name is Asha Sharma. I'm the Managing Director at SID-Washington, and we're delighted to have you here. So after what were hopefully lively discussions during lunch, we're going to transition into one of our breakout panels. Today's topic will be What's in it for me? How U.S. engagement in international development is crucial to maintaining security, prosperity, and freedom at home. Here to lead us in the discussion is Carla Koppell, a SID-Washington board member and also the Vice President for the Center for Applied Conflict Transformation at the U.S. Institute of Peace. Her full bio, as well as the bios of these speakers, are available on our conference app, which I hope you've all been able to download. Now I'll hand it off to Carla.
Thanks so much, Asha. Good afternoon. I always feel like there's a little bit of a special burden placed on mid-afternoon panels, so we're going to be lively and entertaining, and also we want to be really interactive. And in talking about the panel, we really wanted to sort of kick off with some comments, but then engage all of you in question and answer, but a discussion, in part because what we really think is that the community of practice needs to get together around this question and sharpen our answer when we're asked about the relevance of development assistance to foreign policy and to national security. We have a wonderful, august, and wise group of folks up here to kick off that conversation with all of you. I'm not, and I think it's incredibly nifty that there is a conference app. I will not go into detail on the bios of the panelists, but I will introduce them by their current roles. John Norris, immediately to my right, as Executive Director of Sustainable Security and Peacebuilding Initiative at the Center for American Progress. Ken Wallach is the President of the National Democratic Institute, and Ambassador Kurt Volker is Executive Director of the McCain Institute for International Leadership. And it is great to have you guys here for this conversation. And I want to acknowledge that we in the room are all people very committed to this field. And so what I've asked folks to kick off doing is really to look through the lens of somebody who perhaps is less committed to foreign assistance, international development aid as an essential part of the national security arsenal, and try to make the deepened case from differing perspectives. And I know this morning in the conversation, Peter McPherson and Gail Smith touched on some of these rationales, but we're gonna start by thinking that through. So if I might, I'm gonna turn first to Ambassador Volker. Kurt, when you look through an economic lens at the question of how foreign assistance helps us at home, what's the strongest case that you would make?
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much, Carla, and thank you for inviting me here. I appreciate the opportunity. And I'm going to kick off extending what you said at the beginning, because I think it's an important point to make. I know a large number of people who are experts in the field of international development would just see it as a natural, a given. Of course, supporting international development, providing foreign assistance is a good thing to do. Of course we should do that. It's not even debatable. But that truly, at least from a domestic political perspective, is a minority view, a very strong, small minority view. And I think it's important that people think about this not just as a communications challenge, like how do we communicate better why this is a good idea. Think of it as a real challenge as to purpose and meaning and accomplishment. Like, why is this actually a good thing? I think there are a lot of people in this country who would be very happy to say, it's not my problem. Other countries have problems. We have problems. Let's solve our problems. Why do we have to solve other people's problems? So I think it is really important to actually meet that test by answering that credibly. What is the issue here? And that gets to the question that you posed to me is from an economic perspective, and I'll try to broaden that a little bit better as well. It gets down first to the issue of purpose. What is the purpose of supporting international development and the purpose of providing foreign assistance? A very, very small portion of that purpose, an important one and one that I think we should all care about, but it is a relatively small portion, is humanitarian relief, where there are disasters, conflicts, floods, whatever, and there's an immediate humanitarian need. And so that is something. A more important purpose it's a purpose that drives more of the funding and more of the decisions that we make and more of what we support, is to try to prevent things that will get worse. That there are problems that don't just affect a people, as sad as that may be, who are in a given place. It's that untreated or unaddressed, those problems will fester and get worse and affect more people and ultimately affect us. And we'll end up dealing with them one way or another. So I think a key purpose when you think of how to do this is to prevent crises and conflicts from emerging that grow worse, that then, if we do need to address them, end up costing a lot more money. Now, you could still face the argument, well, but why would we even have to do that? So what? So somebody else is having, as President Obama said, we don't want to get involved in other people's civil wars. That's true, but the fact is, oftentimes things don't stand still. And that, I guess, would be another orienting point I would make about the world that we're living in, the role of the United States, is that if the U.S. is not doing something, it does not mean the rest of the world is standing still. There are always things that are happening and changing and challenging. And because we are the biggest power in the world, the most prosperous country in the world, the biggest economy, the most involved politically, the biggest military, we are the target of everybody else's activities. So we can't escape the fact that when things are happening in the world, they will come to us. And so when you look at international development, it's a way of trying to provide a bastion of stability, of decent governance, of education, of development, so that there is resilience in other places, so that we are not a target of bad things, we are not driven into having to deal with them in a much more challenging way. So I think it's an easy investment in some of that basic security that we can make, as opposed to harder investments later on. And probably the other final point I would make in opening remarks is, for that all to be true, there has to be a high degree of confidence of absorption and improvement. We often face a problem that we will provide assistance, provide development support, and it doesn't change anything. You feel like it's going down a black hole. There is corruption in a country, there are programs that don't work, things get blown up, there are the other forces that are creating instability and problems are overwhelming, and our assistance is not changing that. So you're just continuously paying good money after bad. And that, I think, is something actually for anyone involved in supporting international development, supporting foreign assistance, working in foreign policy. I think that is a critical thing to look at, is to try to make sure that we've put the pieces in place where you can have a credible expectation of making an improvement, not just providing resources, but actually bringing about sustainable change, so that the problem isn't the same after having tried to address it as it was before. So those would be some opening thoughts that I would have to throw out there. I'll throw it back to Carla, and I look forward to the discussion that we'll have coming up.
Great, thanks very much. And I know that one of the other issues that came up from an economic perspective that I think Gail Smith mentioned this morning was around the promotion of trade as well, and how that builds out from development assistance.
Yeah, basically, if you have a higher level of economic performance someplace, there is more capacity. And there is therefore consumption. People want to buy things, so they can buy your products. They can also make things that you want to buy, and where there's comparative advantage, you'll do that. And so it builds, and then trade itself is wealth generating, so it then becomes perpetuating as well. But getting to that level, it gets to some of these other issues. You got to not be in a conflict. You've got to have good governance. You got to have a good rule of law climate. So all of these basics that you need to get to where there's an actual economic benefit.
Great. Thanks so much. Ken, looking at it through the lens of democracy, rights, and governance, I can think of no one better than you to talk about why it is we should be forward-leaning and engaging in a development assistance agenda. Can you talk a bit about that?
Well, thank you, Carla. And I think I would agree with almost everything Kurt said. I think we come to the same place, but from slightly different beginnings. I'd like to begin by retelling a story of a dinner almost 20 years ago that I attended, hosted by Strobe Talbot at Brookings Institution. And the subject for dinner was democratization, economic development, and the discussion for a good 45 minutes, hour, was dominated by a handful of academics who talked about economic development and sequencing, and once you build a strong middle class, and then you have economic development, people out of poverty, certain institutions that are built in the country, then you can begin talking about democratization and political development. And this went on for a significant period of time, and Lane Kirkland, the then Secretary General of the AFL-CIO, listened quietly. He asked to speak, and in his soft South Carolina drawl, leaned forward and said that those courageous Democrats who stood in front of tanks in Hungary in 1956 didn't do so General Electric could open up a light bulb factory in Budapest. They did it because they were yearning for freedom and for individual rights. And he said, we support them because it's the right thing to do. And that has stuck with me for 20 years, that comment. And I think probably for most people in this room, it defines why we do this work. In a sense, if we wanted to engage in national security, we probably would have found employment in different places. And there is also a more practical reason why we normally don't use the language, the national security language, in the work that we do. Because relationships on the ground in the countries where we work are not built on the language of what's in it for me. To build a relationship based on trust, one has to view this as mutually reinforcing, that there are mutual and shared interests in this work. And so, therefore, in order to achieve the objectives of the work that we do, everything comes down to relationships on the ground. I recall an op-ed piece by David Brooks, a recent piece, in which he recalls asking a veteran youth activist in the United States about which programs turn around the lives of kids living in poverty. And the response was, I still haven't seen one program change one kid's life, he said. What changes people is relationships. So I say that just at the outset, that ultimately for practical reasons and for the values that we hold, we are engaged in this because I think we believe it's the right thing to do. Nevertheless, I believe the work that we do also represents a convergence of our security interests, our national interests, and our values, and we should not be shy, particularly here, about emphasizing the former. This means walking and chewing gum at the same time. For the democracy promotion community, democracy promotion has long been a pillar of American foreign policy, but in recent years has, in certain circles, become an issue of some debate. Paradoxically, and wrongly in my view, democracy assistance is viewed either as too soft or idealistic as a response to serious security threats facing the nation, or it is seen as too bellicose, conflated with regime change and the use of military force. The real issue, however, is not whether democracy promotion is hard or soft, or whether it fits neatly into the realism or idealism paradigm. The issue, rather, is whether advancing democracy is an important means of advancing America's interests and protecting our national security in a turbulent and often violent world. And I think the answer to that is yes. And that the notion that there should be a dichotomy between our moral preferences and our strategic interests is a false one. because our ultimate foreign policy goal is a world that is secure, safe, humane, and where the risk of war is minimal. Yet the reality is that hotspots most likely to erupt into violence are found, for the most part, in areas of the world that are non-democratic, places that have been defined by the Defense Department as the arc of instability. These are places that experience ethnic conflict and civil war. They generate refugee flows across borders. They are places where terrorists are harbored and illegal drugs are produced. The international community has rightly worked to restore order by helping to establish a democratic framework for governance in a number of these places. The response has not always been entirely successful, but on the whole, the introduction of democratic processes and citizen engagement have made these countries less dangerous than they had been. There are those who have argued that the Arab Spring unleashed a new area of instability in the region by toppling repressive but so-called stable regimes. However, this idea that autocracy equals stability collapses under the scrutiny as the remaining supposedly stable regimes are increasingly the locus of conflict, while those that are going through democratic transition, such as Tunisia, or engaged in either political reforms or liberalization, as is the case in Morocco, Jordan, Lebanon, Algeria, are better able to address economic challenges and threats from extremist ideologies and groups. As President Kennedy once said, those who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable. Even from the traditional foreign aid perspective, economic assistance alone cannot achieve sustained economic growth and social stability. Political systems that lack accountability mechanisms or sufficient political and social inclusion are usually plagued by corruption or conflict, both of which undermine the objectives of economic development aid to achieve sustainable growth and poverty reduction. Deforestation, rural dislocation, environmental degradation, and agricultural policies that lead to famine, all traced to political systems in which the victims have no political voice, in which government institutions feel no obligation to answer to the people, and in which special interests feel free to exploit the resources, land and people, without fear of oversight or the need to account. Whether it is terrorism, disease, or refugee flows, in this interconnected and interdependent world, what happens for good or for bad within borders of nations has regional and sometimes global impact. And contrary to that famous tagline in tourism marketing, what happens, let's say, in Kiev or Cairo doesn't stay there. Therefore, at a basic national security level, we have a direct interest in how people live and how they are treated by their governments.
Great, thanks a lot. It's interesting, as I listen to both of you, I'm thinking about this issue of sort of how do the political and the economic play with one another, and maybe we can turn back to that after we hear from you, John. You've spent a lot of time sort of looking at development assistance and how it's evolved, for better, for worse, and in different ways. And I wonder if you could give us a little bit of that historic perspective and where you think it's brought us in terms of effectiveness and the arguments for the effectiveness of development aid.
Yes, and kind of sticking to the theme of why all this works and how you make the case for it. My first real grown-up job in this town as a fresh-faced 25-year-old out of grad school was as a speechwriter here at AID.
I was with him. I can vouch for it.
Young indeed. And, and along with that came the terrible responsibility of having to defend the U.S. aid program around the Thanksgiving table every year. And in a lot of ways, there was Congress, there was everything else, the State Department, but being able to make that case in a compelling way around the Thanksgiving table, I think, is a challenge that we all face right now. Putting it in familiar terms, putting it in compelling terms, and ways that are understandable to answer the age-old question that Congressman Tom DeLay of Texas once asked when talking about the aid program and said, why should we spend money on Ghana and not grandma? And I think there are very, very compelling reasons why. 7 of our 10 largest export markets are former aid recipients, and a bunch of those are countries that were once dismissed as basket cases. Again and again, we see that this is an investment that has had enormous returns for the United States. It's a program that isn't perfect, but it has yielded enormous benefits. Making the U.S. polio-free has saved the United States $221 billion since 1955. $221 billion. And would the United States have been and be polio-free if Mexico, Nicaragua, El Salvador were not polio-free today? The GAO estimates that eradicating smallpox has saved the U.S. $17 billion since 1977. If you look at HIV and AIDS, a single lifetime course of treatment for an individual in the United States who's HIV positive averages about $400,000. When you look at that sum of money, investments in PEPFAR and combating AIDS in Africa and elsewhere suddenly seem like a pretty reasonable investment. If you look at the crisis and reaction in the United States around Ebola, when you had literally a handful of Ebola cases, like 5, 4, 6, that was very closely contained, that set off a near panic in our political system, certainly was around-the-clock news. We had American politicians, who were not spectacularly clever, I would add, suggesting that we close the border until we got a handle on it. The cost of closing the United States border for a single day would easily pay for the entire aid program for multiple years. So the idea of modest investments in pandemic early warning systems, in helping developing countries build up their healthcare systems, things that we've been doing for years that have been a core effort, it makes a huge difference, and it is easily justifiable as an expense. You know, the idea that we would just slash these programs to save money in the short term is the idea, similar in household budgeting, of thinking that if you eliminate going to the dentist and getting checkups every year, it's going to work out great for you over the long haul. And the other part I think that's really important as you go forth and make the arguments about why the aid program is important is to utilize the incredible strength of people who carry it out. Behind the aid program is an incredible panoply of implementers. There are NGOs, there are for-profits, there's the university community, there's the scientific community, there's the Americans who grow food that get shipped abroad, there's the American companies that ship the food, that trucking companies, shipping companies in New Jersey, in New Orleans. And you'll find that your representatives are much more responsive when you make these arguments outside of the Beltway. You know, if there is a congressman from North Carolina and he's got an NGO that comes into his office in Washington, D.C., he'll kind of roll his eyes and say, yes, yes, this is important. And particularly in this kind of environment where everything is under siege all the time and the news is kind of ever more outrageous, it's very hard for reaching out to someone in Washington, a particular representative, and say, you know, this should be your priority. It's an entirely different thing when the president of a university from North Carolina goes into a district office and says, you know, this has been a big focus for us. This funds our scientists. This funds our researchers. We're making enormous difference in the field. It's helping develop technology that we use here at home. A member listens to that. So if you have contacts, you have relationships, person-to-person relationships, you know, if your member served in the Peace Corps, they'll be more receptive. Try to find those, as Ken said, it is those kind of person-to-person contacts that are really compelling when you do this stuff. And I think the sometimes parochial argument, even though it's not my favorite one, because I think it is the right thing to do and it is in the national interest, the parochial arguments can often be quite compelling in this kind of environment, which is one of the reasons the Pentagon always enjoys more money than it knows what to do with, honestly. Thinking back again to our time here at AID, at one point, Jesse Helms was trying to eliminate the agency. The budget was under duress. All of this sounds a little bit Groundhog Day to some of us. You know, and the congressman who had been newly appointed as chairman of the House Appropriations Subcommittee in charge of the aid budget was a guy named Sonny Callahan from Alabama. Sonny Callahan proudly bragged that he knew nothing about the aid program. He wanted to learn about it. He was quite frank in saying that his constituents didn't care about it a whole lot. But he was kind of willing to listen. And lo and behold, Sonny's opinion on foreign aid really changed when he learned that a factory in Dothan, Alabama, was the largest provider in the United States for condoms for America's international family planning programs. And suddenly this was something that was creating jobs in his own backyard. And during that period when we were fighting with Jesse Helms and trying to preserve the independence of the agency and its very existence, we were able to get 46 states that had ed boards that came out with positive op-eds on foreign assistance. And that includes Mississippi, that includes Alabama, that includes Louisiana, that includes Iowa, that includes Nebraska and Kansas. Lots of places where you would think that there is not an entirely receptive audience. So I think if you make the right arguments, you frame them in understandable terms, you make the human case, and as Ken said, you bring it back to the fact that it's the right thing to do. At Thanksgiving table, my trump card always at the end was, there's about 1 billion people who live on $1 a day. Do you really think anybody can live on $1 a day? Do you think that's right? Do you think that's fair? And as people are eyeing their apple pie a la mode, it's really hard for them to make the case that, yeah, I think a bunch of people should be living on $1 a day. So thanks.
Thanks, John. So when we were talking about this conversation yesterday, we started to get into the whole discussion of, where do we go after we sort of do this initial frame, and then we started having the conversation. I said, stop, we can save it for today. But the question that we wanted to sort of chew on with all of you, and then I will open up the floor for your comments and questions, was what really drives the skepticism? And Kurt, I think that you alluded to this a little bit when in your opening remarks, but I think it's really important for us to look at it through the other lens. So I would put the question to each of you, what drives the skepticism and what do we need to do about it to overcome that? And John, I think you're saying, your reference to Groundhog Day is really apt, and what we need to try to do when we're saying how do we overcome this is that 15 years hence, how do we avoid getting into this situation again? So sort of what will inhibit backsliding? How do we make it sort of hermetically sealed part of the national security toolkit that is foreign aid? Who wants to give us the solution first?
Well, I'll say a few words, maybe following up on a couple things. I appreciate John's comments and thinking about them. It makes me very uncomfortable hearing you say that.
Desperate times call for desperate measures.
Yeah, it makes me uncomfortable because I think part of Carla's question is, what are the objections? Well, first question is, why is it the United States' problem? So, yeah, I agree people shouldn't live on $1 a day. But why is that America's problem that they're living on $1 a day? So that's one objection that people would have. The other one is, why is the U.S. government's problem? Because now we're talking about taxpayers, and I'm spending far more than I would like to spend in taxes as it is, and I don't feel that it's going well. Why do I want to see any of that go off someplace else? So I think that's it. So first, is it America's problem to worry about this? That's one objection. Another, is it the U.S. government's problem? The government should be focused on rules of the road and law enforcement at home and creating a playing field so that people can work and make a living and have unencumbered lives at the lowest cost possible. And then another objection that people have is it producing any positive result? I remember a conversation President Bush had with someone about aid in Africa, and he was arguing for the Millennium Challenge account, saying we're a Millennium Challenge Corporation. We've got to create this, and we got to insist on good governance in return. We have to make this conditional. And this person said, look, I've been working in assistance for Africa for 30 years, and that's not how it works. And President Bush's response, then you're fired. If you've been doing this for 30 years and this is still the situation we've got, why? So I think those are the objections that people have. the role of the United States, the role of the government, taxpayers' money going to this, and a sense of, why do we think this is going to make anything different? We may feel better about it. We may be doing good things. We like the values aspect of it. But is it really changing anything? So I think those are the objections there. And that's why I think, at least from my point of view, and addressing some of these objections, the way I come at it is we have to be able to justify foreign assistance as for ourselves. It benefits the United States to do this. If we can't make that argument credibly, then I don't think we can beat those arguments about why do this then.
Great, thanks. John?
Yeah, I mean, I spent a lot of time thinking and exploring kind of why the misperceptions exist, and they are profound. I mean, the most basic one is most Americans think about 20% of the federal budget is spent on assistance programs. It's about 1%. That profound miscalculation really clouds a lot of it. And part of it has been the political practice in this country that traditionally Republicans have run against development assistance when they're out of office and loved it when they're in office. Most people don't realize that the single biggest increases in the aid program, other than the initial development of the Marshall Plan, all came under Republicans. Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush. And Nixon also expanded the program. So there's been this tendency to demonize assistance programs as a political, and use it as a political cudgel when out of power, and then quietly use it as a very important tool in the national interest when they are in power. I think this presidency has gone off in an entirely different direction. This is the first president we've seen that really doesn't believe, I think, fundamentally in the idea of win-win and international cooperation, and that's shaping a lot of the worldview. And I think it also highlights the risk that for the last 8 years, we had Republicans in this town running against anything that this president, the former president, did. Even things they supported, like trade, like immigration reform, like NATO. And now I think people are shocked to see that suddenly people believe all these horrible things, and it's not a neat switch you can flip. But I think there are a couple messaging things that are really important. The effectiveness part is really important, and I think there are lots of success stories. People respond much better when you talk about specifics rather than the whole. If you ask people if we should help fight malaria overseas, they say yes. If you say, do you think we should work on water and sanitation? They say yes. Do you think we should help educate girls and get them in school for the first time? Absolutely. Do you support the foreign aid program? No. And that plays out again and again, that the name has very little cachet. The sum of the parts actually are fairly impressive. And I think that an awful lot of this has gotten wrapped up in people's view of government and confidence in government. And if you look historically, the polling numbers around the public's confidence in government and the view towards foreign aid, they almost exactly mirror each other. And I think it makes sense that if you don't think the U.S. government can do anything right, or you don't have much faith in how it's run, the idea that it's going to effectively spend money overseas is probably really, really low. So I think we're in a very interesting moment right now. Will the kind of Freedom Caucus, Trump folks suddenly warm to the idea that foreign aid is being handled responsibly because their guy is in the presidency, in the same way that we saw economic confidence numbers flip among Republicans on election day? Or will other people who traditionally supported the aid program, now who've got so little faith in the government, also become aid skeptics? I think it's a really interesting moment and a really interesting time. And I'm not sure how it'll play out.
Thanks. Ken?
A couple things. I think none of this is going to turn the American people into strong advocates for foreign aid. It's not going to be an issue that is going to be popular, which is why we have representative government. And I think to some degree we can work around the edges on these issues. John talked about a number of states around the country. Many of those are export states. When you look at Iowa, when you look at Minnesota, when you look at Montana, you look at Kansas. These are farming states. These are states that have huge exports, Minnesota. These are all states that, by and large, are rather internationalist states, and they recognize that there is a connection between jobs and development in their own states. Don't forget there are a lot of federal programs that aren't popular either. I mean, federal disaster relief is not as popular for the next state than it is for your state going through a disaster. And it's hard to educate people that this is why you have federal disaster relief, because it may hit you tomorrow, even though it's hitting somebody else today. And I think that ultimately the bottom line, as I said, in this interconnected world, that if autocracy and poverty and conflict are the source of refugee flows, terrorism, and disease, then we have not only a responsibility, but we have an interest in ensuring that there is less autocracy, less poverty, and less conflict around the world. And we're a big country that fortunately has the resources that can invest in this for our own national interests. Also, there is a large constituency in the United States in the faith community that also believes it's the right thing to do as well. And that is an important constituency in many places where these issues are not viewed with great enthusiasm by the average person. Finally, let me say, I remember, maybe it was 25 years ago, speaking to my daughter's 4th grade class about what I do, and at the end of my little talk, I asked the class, is this the right thing to do? And 50% said yes, and 50% said no. And I said, why don't you think it's right? They said, we've got our own problems here in the United States. And the name of the grammar school is Lafayette Elementary School. And I said, well, who was Lafayette? And they all knew who Lafayette was. It's part of the civic education. And they suddenly said, okay. And I won over 2 votes as a result of that, but only 2. And I think this is an issue that we have to discuss first and foremost with a community here in Washington that constantly needs to understand these connections and then go beyond. But I think we have to understand that there are certain challenges that I don't think we're going to overcome. But we can improve the environment. We're not going to solve the problems and solve the challenges that we face, and this will be an ongoing challenge.
Thanks, Ken. I am listening to the 3 of you, and you can feel free to disagree with me, but I sort of saw 3 themes which you didn't make explicit kind of come through, which I think are challenges we're going to face by the nature of the work we're doing for the long haul. And it gets a little bit to your point, Ken, that we're not going to win everybody permanently at all. But one is, a lot of what we're working on is prevention. And, how do you prevent the spread of a pandemic? How do you prevent the outbreak of disease? How do you prevent a refugee flow or a conflict? And it's very, very hard to sort of prove that something didn't happen because of your investment, and how you classify that and what you've saved as a result of it. I think the second is, a lot of these investments are super long-term. And so that makes it really hard to prove the causality, and it also, in a world where we're looking for short-term return on investment ever increasingly, and the pace increases on a regular basis, it becomes, again, difficult to justify these long-term investments with long payoffs. And then the third is, a lot of the work that we do is really hard to quantify in terms of what the benefit and the results are. And those 3 make it really hard to craft an argument, and you can break it down by sector, and it's differentiated degrees of difficulty in different sectors, but nonetheless, we're faced with all of those in making this broader case. So I don't know if you think anything, if you agree or disagree, but just wanted to draw those out from what you were saying. I have a long list of questions because we could talk about this for a while, as you can see. But I did want to open up the floor for your comments and questions. And I suppose in theory there's a microphone there. Oh, no, but the microphone is here. So the microphone will come to you if you have something that you'd like to add to the discussion, and I doubt that there's no one who has anything to add to discussion. But if you don't, I'll go back to my list of questions. Please identify yourself by name and affiliation. Sir.
Thank you, Mike Starcinich, longtime Freedom House, heard before, and with about 50% of the contractors on the page today. I've come away more encouraged we can tell the story in the way people will support. And one memory, and then 2 examples. I would ask you to maybe give some more. But in Bosnia, the GAO came over and said, "Is your money being spent well?" I said, "Well, we spend $1 million a year. Some of the projects don't work. It could be $500,000 that isn't really spent that well." I said, "Well, you're talking to the GAO, you know that." And I said, "But you spend $1 billion on the Tuzla Air Force Base and all the other stuff. That's all wasted, because you're just sitting there not using it. And prevention would work better." So that's an example of how this really works. And I think if we looked at Syria and Turkey, and we saw that we do have the cost of failure, we're just waiting on disease. We already had refugees and conflict. So I would encourage you or ask you, how do we compile these stories and make that case persuasive?
Great. And maybe if there are others, we'll take a few and then circle back to the group. Yeah.
My name is Aya, and development management master candidate. I'm from Aleppo, Syria, coming here. I worked for 4 years before with OTI for Syria regional program from Turkey. And the question that keep hitting my mind, and I'm really curious to know your thoughts about it, is like having ISIS in Syria and Iraq, and then in the previous administration, there was like, no military, like direct funds to counter extremism, but we're gonna work in development in different sectors to work on prevention mechanisms. And now with the new administration, it's vice versa. So I'm just curious about the bipolar strategy about how to counter extremism in a very vivid, difficult situation in Syria and Iraq, and given the fact that, I mean, it's proved always in different cases that you cannot prevent anything only with military intervention, because you will always need to keep up with the civil side of the communities affected by extremism.
Great, thanks. Is there a third one we'll take before we go back, or you're in stunned silence? All right. So costs of failure in compiling stories, and then shifts in policy with particularly regard to CVE?
Yeah, on both of those kind of go to a similar example. And yeah, I mean, that's a fact of life in this town, that AID can misspend $10,000 trying to develop a solar bicycle, and it will hear about it in congressional hearings for 15 years. DOD can go up and say, we literally lost $1 billion in Iraq, and we don't know where it is. And staffers will say, "You poor dears, oh, we've suffered. What else can we give you?" And that's just kind of the reality of it. So there is a higher bar because people are kind of looking for the gotcha moment. And I do think our partners abroad are probably having something of whiplash right now between an approach that was not military to almost exclusively military. Hopefully that's just the moment we're in. But clearly the purely military solutions to these things just don't work. We've seen that on the ground in Yemen. We've seen it over the years in Somalia. You can't bludgeon your way out of a political crisis. We've seen it in Afghanistan. We've seen it in Iraq. There has to be a negotiated solution. That's why I'm somewhat puzzled by the current Secretary of State's insistence that there's lots of wars going on, so we don't need diplomacy. We should just have our military, which seems a curious approach. But the other thing I want to emphasize is that, we talk a lot about risk and conflict and crisis. The part we don't talk about enough is opportunity. And that's what a lot of development assistance is about. It's a long-term investment to build up better trading partners, better allies. And the debate in Washington is going exactly the opposite direction of where every single state is going right now. You look at the state level, every single state is trying to figure out stronger international relations. They've got a state trade office that's run out of the governor's office. They're looking at more sister cities. They've got millions of people who've got a foreign-born parent. Exchange programs. They're trying to figure out how to get their agricultural goods overseas. They're really dependent on imports. Every single state is trying to become more effectively internationalized, and we're trying to pull up the ladder in Washington, and it makes no sense at all.
Just one example is in Iraq, where I think you have both in this administration and in the previous administration an understanding in a post-liberation Mosul, you're going to have to concentrate on development and governance. If not, ISIS will return, will fill any political vacuum that's created. I don't think the issue is that people don't care about non-military components to this. The question is that there are well-intentioned notions that may not work in development and governance. For example, the West has this very romantic notion that the way to solve the problems in places like Iraq is federalism and decentralization. In the Middle East, there's no history of decentralization. And if we just completed focus groups and public opinion polls among residents in Mosul and in Nineveh province, and they overwhelmingly oppose decentralization. They oppose it because they believe they're not going to get the resources they deserve. Two, they believe that warlords and corrupt officials will end up dominating, and they want to be part of a strong government. And they want to be part of that government rather than have a decentralized process. And they've never experienced before, so they don't know what it means. And that's exactly the case whether you're in Tunisia, whether you're in many other countries in the region. Lebanon, perhaps, is a country that has greater decentralization. But we have to know that before we begin charging in and advocating certain governance solutions in these environments that may not be supported by the people who live there. So I don't think in this case that people today, policymakers today, don't consider non-military issues. The question is what policies they're pursuing and what policies will work and if we're going to pursue certain policies, you need a lot of preparation to do it among the local population, and it takes resources, it takes time, and it takes efforts to communicate with the people on the ground.
Can I make a different point?
Absolutely.
Just, I want to make a slightly different. So when we've been talking thus far, we've been talking about many different things as if they are part of the same thing. I just wanted to bring that out. So Ken's been talking a lot about democracy, democratization, democracy promotion. I've been talking more about security, conflict prevention, conflict. John has been talking a bit more, and Carla coming from as well, more traditional development, economic development. And these are actually different things. They're related, and certainly related, but they are very different. And one of the things that I think I would stress among all of these is you can't do any of them successfully if you don't recognize that there are people trying to do the opposite. So like in your world, Ken, you have the dictators, you have the small interest groups, you have the corrupt people, and they are actively trying to not have the democracy and the values and the protection of rights that you're talking about. And the same in the
Some
development.
of them used to be Democrats.
Yes, some of them used
In
people
opposition.
that we funded. Yes, you're going there next week.
I liked Viktor Orban when he had long hair.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And in the same in the development side, I mean, there are a lot of places where we might like to see economic development and healthy economies and education and spreading of that wealth so it's less stratified in society. And there are lots of places where the people are trying to do exactly the opposite, trying to preserve wealth for a few at the expense of others. And likewise in security, and this gets to your question about CVE and counter-violent extremism, the reason we have an issue with counter-violent extremism is because there are extremists who are trying to convert people and kill people. And so we need to actually be focused that we have to be going after that problem of people trying to do that. There is a degree to which that can be intellectual activity, a nuanced activity where you're working with language, you're working with ideas, you're working with exposure to information. It might have more of a tricky law enforcement and covert aspect of opening up websites, shutting down websites, targeting communications. But it might just have a really kinetic aspect to it too. It might be that you just take out some of the people that are doing this. What I think we found, I really liked your phrase, we're not bipartisan, we're bipolar. I think that's very good. What we had, as I saw with the previous administration, was a lot of rhetoric that made people around this space very comfortable, but not doing very much. And now we have rhetoric that makes people very uncomfortable. And yet I also see that there's an effort to do something, both militarily, but I was very impressed. It took me by surprise to see Saudi Arabia agree to host a internet-based, website-based center in Riyadh, trying to attack the idea of terrorism within Islam. Well, if anybody needs to do it, it's the Saudis. So that's great. I think it's terrific that they're doing that. That's something I had not expected at all. So who knows what will come of that, if it's a sincere effort, if it's to be a successful effort, whether the Wahhabis will still go around it. But I think there needs to be all of the above, is what I guess I'm saying. There needs to be a hard security effort with a lot of edge to it. There needs to be a democracy promotion, human rights, freedom promotion. There needs to be a developmental effort. And I think we have to look across the spectrum and be able to talk about it as a whole.
Thanks. And I think also there needs to be probably an acknowledgement of where things are falling short and where we need to do things differently. I mean, we talked about the long-term perspective, but I'm also struck at times by two changes that I think have taken place. So we, U.S. Institute of Peace, hosted something called Passing the Baton, which was the outgoing and incoming administrations in January. And to me, one thing which had transformed over time was a large consensus of all of those people around foreign assistance as a tool for advancing foreign policy in the abstract. Then when you go under that to say, okay, what does that look like? Where do there need to be improvements? What needs to change? That's where there are different views on what is more or less effective and how do you move that forward. But that's significant progress, at least within those who are shaping foreign policy in Washington, D.C. I do think one of my observations from time working with USAID is we talked a lot about, for example, the need to work with local partners and work yourselves out of a job, whether that was in sort of stable developing countries or whether that was in fragile states that we wanted to move towards stability. And yet, when I was looking, for example, at the emphasis on women's empowerment in Afghanistan, the percentage of assistance actually going to Afghan or women-led organizations was like, somebody here will know the exact statistic, but 0.006% of the assistance that was for Afghan women's empowerment went to Afghan women-led organizations. And so there are clearly areas for improvement and enriching the extent to which the rhetoric matches the reality. Ken?
I would just, and I agree completely with Kirk, that these are all concentric circles, and you need traditional development, you need economic aid, you need, I believe, democratization, security, and the question becomes, what is the scale of each of these investments? I remember a few weeks ago, somebody said that he had asked one of the commanders following the killing of an al-Shahab person, how much the Defense Department spent in terms of tracking, targeting, and then killing one individual. And it was $34 million. And the question then was, well, we could probably pay this person off with a lot less than $34 million, and we could probably turn this person to be a support. So the question becomes in a lot of this, what is the scale of the investments, and are there other ways sometimes to deal with these issues that are less costly and perhaps as effective? And so I think that's the issue.
Great. Further comments or questions? Yeah.
Hi, my name is Alice Marinak. I'm here from Deloitte. First of all, thank you for being here. This is something I've been reflecting on for months, so I'm very excited to discuss it with such a distinguished panel. So, as I mentioned, there was the phrase that most Americans haven't met a scientist, and so they were trying to introduce scientists to average Americans. So I came up with the idea most Americans probably also haven't met a diplomat or a development practitioner, and came up with the idea of a model of, you mentioned the Thanksgiving table, but yes, you talk about around the Thanksgiving table, but what about when we go back to our hometowns, we get in touch with a high school teacher or, our nephew's 4th grade classroom and give a talk in a classroom or a library and almost doing an at-home public diplomacy, people-to-people effort. So the question's two-part. One, what do you think that this is a worthwhile approach to this very big issue that we're dealing with? And two, what are your thoughts around mobilizing and equipping the DC development and diplomacy community to do this? Thank you. There's USGLC, SID. Thank you.
Great, thanks. One more question, we'll come back.
Hi, Brenda Pearson from DAI and former country director for NDI earlier in my career, Macedonia, Cambodia. And my question is more of a comment. When you look at the 3Ds, diplomacy, defense, and development, I think development is really the constituent service, talking about the relationship building, the relationships that are built between the aid workers or foreign assistants isn't just limited to whom we encounter overseas, but it's also all the American universities, the research institutes, and that constituent service enriches the life of America. So I think that's part of the argument that needs to be made, is it's not just us in this room or the few thousand people that attend conferences, but it's really a whole part of America that benefits from this relationship building with partners.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, I would just say on the constituency point, it's really, really important. Having worked at AID at a point when the State Department tried to take over AID, they were absolutely gobsmacked by the fact that there was this big constellation of very active people and engaged in this endeavor. They just kind of thought we would go quietly into the good night the way that USIA did, and the Arms Control Act did. We didn't. And we are a community of people that are used to working in demanding situations and having to reach across the table and talk to people and network and understand and listen to people's concerns. And those are the skills that we need right now. And absolutely, I think going to your hometown, talking to a newspaper reporter, talking to civic groups, talking to the Rotary, talking to the Chamber of Commerce, there's an awful lot of support for these things, that there is very little that the aid community does that most Americans don't support if you talk to them about it. There are some things like police reform and other things that are kind of hard, messy business. But when you talk about 95% of the work of the people in this room do, you're going to get a very good response to it. And I think that's really important to remember. And as Kurt pointed out, these are disparate and sometimes overlapping activities, but they do all live under one tent in a sense, and that they are all under profound assault right now. And the idea that we could cut over 30% from state and AID without profoundly crippling America's self-interest and its role in the world is just crazy. The idea of putting out a 30% cut was done on the back of a napkin. It was not a serious policy exercise. It's not a serious plan. It was impulse. And you look at some of the specific things that were cut in the budget that's been released. It zeroes out famine early warning systems, things that save thousands of lives, cost almost no money in the middle of a historic famine. Why in God's name would anyone think that was a good idea? It's absolutely indefensible. So I think we have a lot of ammunition to make these arguments. And I think, it isn't just that it's the right thing to do or it's in our interest. Different constituencies respond to different parts of the arguments in different blends. But I think that the case for it is indeed very strong.
I think there's a relation, go ahead, Kurt.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, I think there's a relationship between the two questions, and I think and it's interesting that it comes up today. Just this morning, I was talking with somebody, colleague, who wants to undertake an effort related to putting a face on development and development experts and diplomats who've been serving in conflict-affected and fragile states, because there's a whole narrative now out there about the PTSD suffered by our armed forces for service in conflict zones, and yet there's almost no recognition or cognizance of the enormous number of diplomats and development professionals who have served in those same places with the same consequences and with much less support for the work that they're doing. So I think it's incredibly important to view the work that goes on in this field as public service in the same way that we look at other areas of expertise, and very much to have that be an all-encompassing view, particularly as we see the number of development-assisted countries being fragile and conflict-affected, and that becoming increasingly overlapping circles. Kurt?
Thanks. I just wanted to come back to the question about hometown engagement, whatever you would call that. When I was most recently in the State Department, which was the Bush administration, they had a program for exactly that. So people who were visiting, you have I don't know what the number is, 6,000 Foreign Service officers, something like that. When people were going home, which everybody does, and they're from all over the country, you could get funding from the Public Affairs Bureau to do public outreach, and even the Public Affairs Bureau would help you do it. So they would contact some people on your behalf. I did this a few times. You need radio stations, newspapers, schools, universities, things like that, Rotary clubs, et cetera. So I don't know if that program still exists, and I have no idea, even if it does, if somebody found out about it, whether they would keep it. But
Yes. Or hunting rabbits. Yeah.
But it did exist, and it was a very low-cost program. You're talking about, handfuls of dollars to help people out when they're already going home to their home communities anyway. The other thing that is out there, the American Academy of Diplomacy, which I'm a member, has a program for this as well. I like this one actually better. Maybe it's just my bad choices or bad taste, because you're getting really, really amazing people. The American Academy of Diplomacy is basically former ambassadors, former assistant secretaries, and up. So you're getting people who have a wealth of experience, really, really diverse knowledge base. And I went with a group about 2 months ago to Texas Tech University in Lubbock, Texas, and we spoke at the university. We spoke with a group of high school students that were bussed in from many communities around. We did a town hall sort of event. We had a fundraising dinner for the university. We did local media, both television and radio. I'd say we saw about 500 people in that visit, and we connected probably with about 5,000. Which was great. And I think the American Academy would be delighted to do that and really roll out some super people. They just need to have more funding support to do that sort of thing.
I would also add an organization that has done a tremendous job in recent years, and that's the USGLC, the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition. Because there were no constituencies in the country for foreign aid. And those were the days where the foreign aid bill passed by 1 or 2 votes, or not at all. And the Israel portion of the bill is what carried the foreign aid bill. And the USGLC, I think, has done a very good job of helping to not create constituencies, but coalesce constituencies on this issue. But it's a daunting task. And if you look at the advertising budgets of corporations for products they're trying to sell, and compare that to the budgets of groups that are trying to do this, those budgets dwarf what can be done. And so therefore we have to understand what can be done. It has to be very strategic. And we have to understand, in a sense, limitations as well as opportunities as well, because then we're going to end up fooling ourselves that somehow we can change an entire population of the United States to support this. So it has to be done in a very strategic and targeted way. And I do believe the USGOC has done an excellent job in that.
We'll take one more question and we'll wrap up, but I will mention that there's also the Diplomacy Center that's opening over at the State Department, which is a museum dedicated to diplomacy and development, and does feature a number of Foreign Service officers and should be opening relatively soon. And that's a nice way to get all the tourists that come through DC to learn about this area of expertise. There. Oh, okay. All right, I'll do two. Fine. And then in the back corner.
Hi, thanks. Angela Yu from the United States Naval Academy. As you know, we graduate future naval and Marine officers. Very simple question. What would you like these future leaders to do more when they become in a position of policymakers, and so with regards to development? So the military in the future, what would you see as their role with regards to development in an ideal world?
And I'm told there's a patient soul in the back corner. Okay.
Hi, Ashley Nichols with PwC. I'd love to hear your perspectives. I am from a small town in Indiana, truly Trump land, and it's very not diverse. People don't leave that town their entire lives. I think
Which town?
It's called Crawfordsville, 40 minutes west of Indianapolis. I think that the average percentage of Americans who have a passport is 22%. My guess is that Crawfordsville would be 2% or less. And so my question is, I think it's a great idea that, go and talk about diplomacy, go and talk about development. But in my hometown, there's really the sense of us versus them, us versus the rest of the world. When a disaster happens, or Haiti, for an example, when Haiti got taken out by a hurricane, no interest at all, because they weren't part of us, they weren't like us. And so I guess my question here for you is, beyond bringing diplomacy back to the hometowns and sharing what we're doing, how do we make the world smaller? How do we really show they're just like us? They are our neighbor. Helping them helps us. I get the point about pandemics and famine and all of that, but really, how do we bring the human element of, you may have never met a person from another country, but they play a role in your life as well? Thank you.
Two great questions to end on. So you can answer those two questions and give whatever your final one-liner is. Ken, you're up first. Because you're farthest away from me.
Well, I went to school in one of those towns in Indiana, so I spent 4 years with people who had similar attitudes. I also remember, too, when I went to college, the Ku Klux Klan marched across Route 40. But also things have changed in Indiana as well. Again, I don't think some people are going to be reached on this level. And I think it's better to reach decision makers and to have them be the spokesperson on these issues than trying to go into these small communities, because these same communities would feel naturally the same way about a disaster across the border in Illinois. Once there was a famous journalist, Mike Royko, that wrote a column in the Sun-Times saying the state of Indiana had no reason to exist. And the city council in Indianapolis sent him a bus ticket and asked him, if you're going to criticize us, you ought to visit. So he visited and came back and apologized to the people of Indiana. He meant Iowa. So I think this is a real challenge, and I think that's why a strategic approach. You're never going to be able, even in the advertising business, people say half of advertising is wasted, but people don't know which half. That you're not going to reach everybody, but you can try to reach key people who ultimately can be a multiplier effect. And there are representatives and local officials who are engaged in these issues. There are veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan. We have members of our board, and they know each other. And they're all engaged in some of these issues now because they've seen it on the ground in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, that these are issues that that intersect, and you need to do it all. And I think that there are organizations that have emerged as a result of this. There are associations that people can join, and I'm a big believer in pluralism is throwing as much as you can against the wall, and eventually, hopefully, you can make things stick on these issues. But it's not going to be everywhere.
A couple thoughts on the two questions together. I think people in a small town like that, and I grew up near or in one of those two, they want to know that people are taking care of themselves and their own communities. Right? That's what we should do in our community. That's what they should do in their community. And if they are presented with things in a way that it seems like that's not happening, very hard to get to a threshold of helping. So why should we? This is what we face. NATO, my bread and butter issue for a long time. That why should we care about Europe's defense more than Europe does? Why? It doesn't make. I think you can parse that argument, but bottom line is very hard to explain. So that gets to an issue of respect then, which is people in a small community like that are going to respect people elsewhere in the world or not, based on whether they think they're actually tackling their own issues. So that's one thing, and you talk about stories or information, that's what you'd want to get out, is that people are actually doing things and working and making change themselves. That will help. And then that gets to where I would recommend your Naval Academy graduates put an effort. We have a tendency, especially the military, but as a tendency as Americans more broadly, to want to fix things. That we see a problem, we think about how to solve it, and then we want to solve it. And I would say, I think it's important for people who are going to be professionals going into leadership roles in the military or in diplomacy or development, whatever, focus instead on how to create the conditions where people can fix things. Because if we fix them, it's not sustainable. And it's not going to last. And we may even be resented for doing it. So I think it's much more important to focus on what are the conditions that need to take hold for people to fix things themselves. And sometimes that is a hard security thing. Sometimes it's business climate. Sometimes it's education. But it's getting out of taking ownership of we're going to fix this and being more in the position of trying to empower. And I think if we were successful with that, we would probably have a better time with the Indianas.
Very quickly on the 2 points. The buy-in among flag officers regarding the importance of development is remarkable, and it's pretty sweeping. Their understanding of how it actually works is horrendous. And they support it, they want it to work. And to echo what Kurt was saying, Afghanistan and Iraq are littered with projects that were funded by the military where they go in and they'd say, there's not a hospital here. Let's build a hospital. We can do it. We've got the concrete. It'll get a C-130 in here. And they build a hospital. A year later, the hospital's totally unused, and it's fallen apart. And they kind of say, why is that? And it's because they don't understand development as a vocation. They didn't get people on the ground to say, well, are there nurses here? Are there doctors here? Where did people go for health care before? If a hospital was to be built, will people pay fees to come here? Where do they go for services? Will women be able to access these facilities? Will they be built differently? Will they be treated differently? Will there be separate entrances? Will there not? They don't ask any of those 1,000 questions you need to sit down and ask with a community so that they actually own the project at the end. So I think the compassion, the understanding that this is a strategic and moral imperative is there in the military. The understanding the mechanics and how it actually works on the ground still has a ways to go. In Crawfordville, I'm guessing at some point Crawfordville had a fire, a flood, a factory explosion. I'm guessing some people probably came in to help out a little bit. I grew up in a Rust Belt town in upstate New York. Had flood water on the second floor in the mid-'70s after Hurricane Agnes. National Guard came in and helped out. I still remember the helicopters landing on the quad of the local university. There's lots of places in the world, almost every place in the world, where people need a hand occasionally. Oral rehydration salts cost a couple pennies per packet, save millions of lives every year so kids don't die from diarrhea because they don't have access to a hospital or health care. It's really simple things, doesn't cost very much. Those kids, maybe they grow up, they've got jobs, Crawfordsville, whatever they make, they're going to be able to export more, people are going to be able to buy more. It's an investment in their own future. So, and thank you, and thank you, Carla.
So I don't know if I'm supposed to answer, but I'm going to answer because they're great questions. So on the Naval Academy, I think there are two pieces. One is about what the Naval Academy should do, which is help to create some of this understanding for the people that are coming through the system, because I think that will be an enormous added value if folks on the defense side really understand the diplomacy and development pieces. And then I think encouraging them, once they know that, to make this case, because it's incredibly compelling to have folks from defense, and we'll hear that now, talk about the value of development and its connections, and to tell those stories back home, because we know they also come from communities that often are different communities than those from which development experts and diplomats come from. And so I think that's a really important role. I think with regard to the small town, my answer is Airbnb. And I say that only partly in jest, because friends of mine have Airbnb. And they have these people coming through all the time from across America and across the world. And when I talk to them about their experience with it, the answer is always the same. These people are all thinking about the same things. They have the same challenges. They have the same concerns. And they're really just trying to create a better situation for their kids and their families, and to create a better future. And it's that personal connection that really is truly transformative. And I know everybody's not going to have Airbnb, and not everybody's going to go to that town, but by telling those stories, by making about those people, by explaining who the Haitians are and that their aspirations and dreams are exactly the same, you can win over, not everybody, Ken is right, but you can win over a large, large share of those folks. With that, I want to thank you for a great conversation, and please join me in thanking our panelists for the conversation.